patience, patience, because I have it in another incarnation. I hope. No, it's disappeared. Anyway, it's a wonderful map because what it shows is it's of the Pacific Ocean, and it has Japan just off the coast of Southern California. They greatly underestimated the size of the world and the size of the Pacific Ocean. So Japan is about where Catalina Island is. You know, on a clear day you can see Los Angeles. But of course the Pacific Ocean was in fact much wider. Now, the Dutch instructions included that to explore the lands to the east of the Spice Islands. The Spice Islands means the eastern Indonesian islands, and seek a passage through to the Pacific Ocean. And in the very following year, the Doofken under Willem Janszoon visited Cape York. Now, Janszoon's conclusion was that there was no good to be done there. He wrote the first description we have of Australia, and it is the most depressing description you could ever read. He says that there was neither gold nor spices nor palaces nor people to trade with. There is no good to be done there. Right, so he was very unimpressed. Later, the Dutch started accidentally exploring the west coast of Western Australia. So this was the exploration of Gulf of Carpentaria and Cape York. The reason they explored the west coast of Australia was that the sailing route to Java took them due west, or due east, following the westerly winds from South Africa to a point near here. Then they would turn north to take advantage of the prevailing westerly winds and avoid the monsoonal winds, which go in a different direction at different times of the year, further north in the Indian Ocean. So they avoided the tropical part of the Indian Ocean until the very last stages of the voyage. Inevitably enough, eventually they hit Australia, which they called New Holland. And so this was charted, all of this was charted, in the first 3 decades of the 17th century, beginning in 1616, which was when the first Dutch record of Western Australia was made. Now there was the first European settlement of which we know anything in Australia occurred as a result of this. A Dutch East Indies Company ship, the Batavia, was wrecked on the Western Australian coast in 1629, and that was Australia's first temporary European settlement, and a very nasty place indeed it was. The Batavia had a mutiny on at the time. The mutiny was very bloodthirsty. There was lots of murder, lots of rape, tyranny by the mutineers, and then after the captain set off in a longboat to row to Batavia, which he reached, he came back, and then there was awful punishment handed out on the mutineers. They were mutilated, their hands were cut out, their tongues were pulled out, and then they were gruesomely executed by being pulled apart, hacked apart. So European history in Australia does not begin with a very encouraging story. Right? It's a pretty brutal and nasty story. And I've got the story of the wreck of the Batavia on the Views site. There was an opera of the Batavia, the only R-rated opera ever performed at the Sydney Opera House. Music by Richard Meal, and a gruesome thing. You know, it really is R-rated. It's an R-rated story. On to something a little more morally uplifting. Antonio van Diemen was Governor-General of the Netherlands Indies in the 1640s. In fact, he died in office. And he was really the first rational explorer. He sent his best navigator, a man called Abel Tasman, whose name is commemorated in Tasmania, which before it was called Tasmania, in 1856 it was renamed, it was called Van Diemen's Land. And he sent him on a vain quest for riches around Australia. There were 2 voyages, The aim was semi-scientific, but riches was still the aim. And as a result of that, this map illustrates it. Here are Van Diemen's voyages starting from Mauritius, and you can see them there. He touched on Tasmania, which he speculated was part of the mainland of Australia. He touched on New Zealand, which he called Statenland, just like Staten Island in New York. You get the same Dutch names in New York, in South Africa, and around the coast of Western Australia. Right? And you used to have them in Indonesia, but they have Indonesianised them now, which is a bit of a loss, but I guess that's to be expected. There's no longer Velsereden in Batavia, but old people still call it that. So we get these same Dutch names repeated in where the Dutch were, in New York, in South Africa, and around the coast of Western Australia, and we used to have them in Indonesia. So, after Van Diemen basically discovered nothing, nothing of any value, nothing to make money with, the Dutch stopped their exploration. So the next exploration of Australia is by the English, and the motives are very different. We now come to the 18th century. And in the 18th century, the world has changed. Religion has declined in importance. Right? Faith is no longer as strong. The battle between Catholic and Protestant no longer seems important. The air of rationality is around. The new gods are science and reason, especially, funnily enough, in France and Scotland. And of course that country between the two of them, England, was massively influenced by this essentially French and Scottish movement of the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment was about logic and using humanity as the measure of the world. As well as questioning religion, the Enlightenment also questioned all sorts of other things, including education. The Swiss philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose years are there, 1712 to 1778, had an interesting concept, and that was he believed that Europe was so violent because of education and civilization. And he thought that human beings were inherently better if they weren't civilized. This was the concept of the noble savage. He based this on some idealistic reports of life among the Huron Indians of North America. Now, the Huron used to go around scalping each other. And Huron society, the Iroquois and all that, was anything but an idyllic, noble, happy, environmentally friendly civilization. Quite the reverse. In fact, the cultures of North America and Central America were extremely violent. We'll get on to Aztec religion in a few weeks' time. That's a really lovely story. So this concept of the noble savage, to my mind, is tendentious, to say the least. But the big issue he was raising is this. Is mankind, or humanity, of course they said man at the time, is man inherently good or evil? Now, of course, Christianity says that because of Adam being tempted by Eve and eating the apple, humanity has fallen from a state of grace and has a tendency to evil. Right? Catholics tend to be less strong on original sin and the evil nature of humanity than Protestants. That's one of the doctrinal differences. But Christianity basically holds that mankind is flawed. Rousseau postulated that maybe mankind in his natural state is good. Humanity is good. Actually, as he got older, he became more cynical. In one of his early books is Emile. This is about the education of a young kid who was allowed to run around and be wild for his entire childhood and adolescence, and grew up to be extremely well educated and socially kind and friendly and idealistic. Fat chance. As he got older, he rather rejects this idealistic view that we see in Emile, and in one of his later books, The Social Contract, Le Contrat Social, he argues that rule is based on a social contract between those who rule and those who govern. and that human beings actually need law. Right? So that he says law can overcome the natural flaws in humanity and a social contract, which is a little more realistic. But the concept of the noble savage from the early Rousseau was an important one. Now, James Cook, whose years are there, and Joseph Banks were very influenced by these ideas. They're Enlightenment figures. Cook was a man of relatively humble origins, but a genius.